Next, from the Union League Club of Chicago, former Governor Jim Edgar hosts a panel that questions how to end the culture of corruption in Illinois politics. This panel is part of the Illinois Integrity Initiative, organized by the University of Illinois. This runs about 1 hour and 10 minutes.
And we're glad to have the Illinois Channel here, because no matter what size crowd we have here, we know we'll have millions out there watching us. Let me just start out. And by the way, all the other moderators were asked to do a paper. They didn't ask me to do a paper, which I'm glad. But maybe it also says something about what they thought my knowledge would be. I'm going to make a few observations before I turn to my fellow panelists. And I've written down some things. And I wrote these down last night, and I'd written some the day before. And it's interesting, a lot of my little phrases have already been used, like, there is no silver bullet. And I think if nothing else we can agree on from this group today is there's no one answer to trying to reform or bring about ethical behavior in government. I have to say I personally have reservation about legislation being the way to solve this problem. Now I have to tell you, when I first started out 40 years ago as a legislative intern, I thought legislation was the answer to most problems, and particularly bring about reforms. The longer I've been around, the less I think maybe that's the way to go about it. Also, there's been discussion, and I know this is not the purpose of this forum to talk about campaign finance reform, though it does enter into the whole questions of ethics. I think the Supreme Court in some of its recent decisions has almost made that impossible. And maybe we ought to spend more time thinking about how do we change the Supreme Court than worry about some of these other things. But unfortunately, I think any attempts that would be useful, and I don't think too many to this point have been useful. There's always a way around all those campaign reform laws. But whatever might have been able to do, like the thing that they were disappointed with Governor Quinn that they couldn't put the caps on the transfer out of funds, which to me was the key. Doesn't matter now. You can try and create a fund and do whatever you want with it. So the Supreme Court, I think, has made this that avenue very difficult. Short term, I always thought that you know what the U.S. Attorney, Mr. Fitzgerald's been doing would have a pretty positive impact. I mean, sending people to jail gets folks' attention. But as been pointed out, we had George Ryan's problem. He went off to prison, and Rod Blagojevich didn't learn. We continue to have aldermen. Now, as a downstater, it seems like half the aldermen in Chicago go to jail. Huh? Only a third, okay. But that continues to happen. So even that doesn't seem to be the silver bullet. So the discussion, I think, about changing culture is very relevant. I think you can change culture. I had a little experience in the early 80s when I became Secretary of State on driving under the influence. I remember when we first started our attempts to curb drunk driving in Illinois, everybody says that's ridiculous. You're not going to change people's habits. That's acceptable. People aren't going to change. Well, in 30 years, it's changed. I mean, it's gone farther than I ever dreamed it would go. And there were three things there that worked. One was penalties, and I think penalties have to be part of this long-term solution. Also, education. Education to me did work, and I'll never forget as Secretary of State when I got told that there were chapters being formed in high schools made up of teenagers against drunk driving. It was called SAD, Students Against Driving Drunk. And when I heard that, then I knew we were making progress. I mean, now they weren't telling other teenagers not to drink, just don't drink and drive. But still, that to me was a major breakthrough. And so you can, I think, educate the public and begin to change culture. Third was public outrage about drunk driving. You know, it used to be people laughed about it. Today, people lose their jobs about it. I mean, it's come full circle, not full circle, come 180 degrees. So you can change, I think, culture. Again, you have to do a variety of things. It doesn't happen overnight. These are my quick observations of what can be done, and it starts with the elected official. Anybody who runs for office, I think, has to know they have to kind of be a little purer than the average citizen. They have that responsibility if they're going to have the privilege of serving an elected office. If they ever have any doubt about what they're going to do, how it might be perceived, then don't do it. The other thing I think is very important for people in leadership position is they need to set a pretty clear parameters to the people working under them, what's accepted and what's not accepted. I think too often people think, well, they don't really care, I can kind of do this. I got to tell you, it was a great education to become Secretary of State of Illinois when you're 34 years old and learn how driver's licenses are given out, particularly in the northern part of the state. There was something I found they called the VIP list. And those were people who came in the driver's facility, and I don't know, again, downstate, we never experienced this. It didn't take you that long to get a driver's license downstate. In Chicago, you used to have to take a day off from work because the lines were so long. So it was really important if you could get put in front of the line. And I said, that's not fair. Who do you do this for? Well, important people. Who? Well, the main group were the press. That's who the main people that wanted to get put in front. And it was shocking. And, of course, you didn't want to make the press mad. But also, when I first came in as Secretary of State, I think I was in office about 2 days, and Channel 7 investigative reporters showed up saying, we've got this story about we're going to break about your employees are going to be indicted. And I'd already had a meeting with the U.S. Attorney. I remember Dan Webb, who was on my transition committee, said, we need to go talk to the U.S. Attorney. This was about 2 weeks before I was sworn in. I said, what? I'm not even in office yet. Why do I got to go talk to the U.S. Attorney? And they had a major sting, and they were going to indict several employees. And it happened about a week after I became Secretary of State. And so we knew kind of early on we had to send a message, and we had to set parameters. Now, I don't want to suggest that the Secretary of State's office, while I was Secretary of State, was pure and perfect. But I think they also understood if they got caught on anything, they were fired. And it's hard to fire state workers. That's another thing in all this reform you might want to think about, is making it easier that you can discharge state workers who have done something wrong. Because short of conviction, it's really hard sometimes to do that. But I think leaders have to set a parameter. The other thing I would suggest to any elected official, particularly the higher up they go, encourage people that work for you and around you to point out when you might be stepping over the line. I can tell you it's very easy to begin to believe your press releases and to begin to think that you're infallible, that you're smarter and you know how to do these things and it's okay. You need folks who will tell you in a very nice way you can't do that. I was fortunate when I was governor, I had a gentleman who many of you know, Mike Lawrence, who in a very delicate way could say, Governor, you're nuts, you can't do that. So again, I think that's something to keep in mind and to encourage people in your staff to say you're wrong as opposed to make them think they can't ever criticize what you do. Now, they don't go out and say that publicly, but they tell you that privately. The other observation I have is that political parties have to be held responsible for their candidates. It's not enough just to help candidates. I think you have to police them a little bit. I will always point out that when Rod Blagojevich ran for re-election, the Democrats did have another alternative in that primary, an alderman who seemed like a reasonable person, maybe not who they wanted to be governor, but I thought far more reasonable than Rod Blagojevich. But they all, I think, except for Lisa Madigan, endorsed him. In the Republican Party, I think we defended George Ryan probably a little longer than we should have, though I don't think he'd have been renominated. But I think political parties have a role to play. Education has been talked about. I think schools need to do a better job of instilling ethical behavior and the need for that. I don't think we ought to do like we did when I was in school. You had 6 weeks public health course, which was a joke, or you had some of the, it's got to be incorporated in the curriculum. And I think that's beginning to happen more, but it has to happen at all levels. The press, again, I think the press was lax a lot of times in this atmosphere that has been created. They were more interested in a good story, and it was pointed out, I think Paul Green used a comment, it is, good government's dull. And so good government doesn't get a lot of coverage. you know, kind of funny behavior or, you know, somebody really going down and twisting arms and all that, that kind of stuff gets attention. And that's all well and good, but I think the media sometimes doesn't spend enough time looking at candidates' records and trying to sense character. I think they could play a much stronger role than they played and help create that public outrage that I think you need to develop. And the last but not least, and perhaps the most important, is the public. I think the public really has the most leverage. I can tell you as an elected official, I used to worry a lot about what the public thought because that's how I got elected and reelected. I think that the public can impact public policy and attitudes of elected officials. They need to take more time and know what's going on. I think the greatest failure of the Illinois electorate was the Rod Blagojevich reelection. I think the news media did a good job in that case of identifying the ethical shortcoming of Governor Blagojevich before that election. The best I'd ever seen. In fact, Chicago television, which I think is the most important and often the weakest as far as looking at these things, I think on a daily basis pretty well called Blagojevich to task. But the public didn't take the time to believe or pay attention. They watched a few 30-second commercials and thought maybe Topinka wasn't any better than Rod Blagojevich and reelected him. Then a few months later, they wanted him out of office. So I think there's all parts of society that has a role to play here, and I think we can do a better job than we have. I think perhaps maybe we missed a great opportunity because I do think the public was pretty outraged over Rod Blagojevich when he was arrested. I think we had an opportunity. I'm not sure the laws were necessarily all the right things to do, but I think we had an opportunity. I think we still have an opportunity, though that window's closing, to try to change the way things are perceived about Illinois politics, the way things are acted in Illinois politics. But it's going to take a variety of things. There's no one silver bullet, and that's my observation. And where's Jim? I want to thank you for bringing up MSI in your discussion about me. I appreciate that. But you know, I think from MSI, well, I might just comment. I think we learned some things, made some changes, and I think we can make changes from some of our problems in the past. But I think the most important change we could make is convincing the public that we don't have to have corruption to have good government, to have effective government, that we can make it different. But they've got to be part of this process. They've got to be involved. They've got to speak up. They need to hold the elected officials accountable. And I think if they do that, I can say most of the elected officials I know will take notice. But it's when they don't pay any attention, or that no one calls you to task for doing something that's maybe questionable, then people begin to think, well, it really doesn't matter. And that's unfortunate. So those are my observations from my 30-some years in government and 40 years of watching the process. I personally think that most people in government are honest. Most want to do the right thing. But I do think if we don't have checks and balances, we can get sloppy. And checks and balances comes from the other party. It comes from the news media. It comes from the academic world. It particularly comes from the public. And we need to see that that is working properly. So with that, let me move now. And Teresa, I'm going to go to you first and let you make your opening comment. They're going to make opening comments, and I'm going to ask them for questions they have of each other. Then we'll turn it to you folks.
Great, thank you. Well, a couple nights ago, I was up in the wee hours of the morning reading the excellent papers prepared for this panel, this symposium today. And in addition to Governor Edgar's thanks, I'd also like to add Jim Nolan for coordinating all of us to be here today. And while I was reading these papers, I received an email from halfway around the world, from a developing country, but it was from a classmate sending birthday greetings. And he was surprised to find me up, and he says, "What are you doing?" I said, "I am reading papers on corruption." And he said, "Oh, that's so funny you mentioned that. This was by email, not, so he said, because I just had a meeting with the Minister of Industry, and he raised corruption as an issue in that country. And the Americans at the meeting said, yes, we understand, we have Chicago. Yes. I didn't find this very funny. And he didn't mean it as in funny, haha, but oh, what a coincidence, funny. So our reputation is not only a matter of local import, but it's also being used as mitigating circumstances in discussions halfway around the world. Now, I think that this panel is designed to address what can be done, how can we change the culture of corruption, and I think it's very important that we talk about non-Band-Aid solutions, but systemic solutions that will last for a while, because it is not an overnight solution. We didn't get here, as prior panelists pointed out. This has been going on in the great state of Illinois for more than 150 years. And although we like to think of the instant gratification, the instant reform, we're talking about decades here. And for decades, we need marathon runners. We don't need sprinters. We need people who are thinking about cradle to grave, what are we going to do to reform this culture in our state? And I tend to think about what can we do systemically. And first, I think we have to posit a vision of clean. Too often, everybody who grows up in the city of Chicago or the state of Illinois, they go, yes, the city that works, wink, wink, you know what I mean, or the state of Illinois, and there's a level of personal acceptance born of not having a higher standard of expectation of what a culture of clean could look like. The reason why, as David Morrison was positing this morning, that Vermont doesn't have to have these laws is because they don't exist in a culture of corruption. They exist in a culture of expectation of clean. Having said that, I do think having the laws are important, and the first set of laws that I would emphasize that need support are the transparency laws. And the transparency laws, I mean the Freedom of Information Act, the Open Meetings Act, and the ability for the citizenry, media, watchdogs, third-party intermediaries of all sorts to understand what is going on in government. Now, today has been dedicated to public corruption, but of course there's all kinds of other corruption, right? Personal corruption, corporate corruption, but in terms of public corruption, the transparency laws, FOIA, and the Open Meetings Act, OMA, should be supported, not continually nitpicked to make them less feasible for the citizenry or the media to use. The Citizen Advocacy Center recently put out a 5-state compilation study of the laws in the Midwest about the Freedom of Information and Open Meetings laws, and Illinois was given an almost failing grade, I believe a D or an F, and that's because even though every state has a Freedom of Information Act, our state exempts all kinds of information, and not only that, there is a hostility that is met by the citizen requester for information about their own government. Media sometimes gets a pass because the media, like being in line first for the motor vehicles or for your driver's license, public officials want to make sure that the media has been policed, but not always. The media too has difficulty getting information from the government, and this requires constant vigilance about how government information is not being released, who is getting it selectively, and what can be done to promote the laws. I cannot tell you how many municipal attorney meetings I have been to as a member of the Bar Association, where I have watched lawyers discuss how best to minimize the disclosure necessary under the Freedom of Information laws. And instead of trying to prevent and subvert the ability of the public to hold the governors that we've elected accountable, and I just don't mean gubernatorial, all of our governing representatives accountable, that this is crucial. In addition to transparency, we need more media. And the media is having a problem because a lot of the print entities are trying to survive in a world of internet. And to some extent, I think the answer is that everyone is the media. And people should be able to, and they're doing so much more so now, but be able to cover and understand. But there has to be an incentive for people to actually participate in the governing body's decision-making and not being dissuaded, as I mentioned in an earlier comment period, from actually being able to attend, understand, and participate in what's going on. Watchdogs. There are a number of good government groups and watchdogs, and what I have seen too often, both at the state and at the federal level, is that number of these watchdogs are tethered to one political party or another. And as a consequence, they pull their punches when it's their peeps in office, their party in office. They're less likely to call people out because they don't want to make enemies amongst their friends. And as a consequence, watchdogs pull their punches when commenting on public officials that are members of the party that they support, or are friends with the funders that give them money to exist. Campaign finance reform, I would term as a much broader proposition and not just the discussion of public financing. I think we need to talk about how do we lower the barriers to entry for people to participate and run for office. I do believe that cultures of clean attract people who want to be part of a culture of clean, and cultures of corruption attract people who want to be part or see that it's easy to participate in a culture of corruption. So how are we going to get good people to run for office who don't want to be part of a culture of corruption and don't want to be tainted by quote-unquote dirty politics, because they think that's the way it is in the state of Illinois. And so lower barriers to entry are not just public financing, but also we have to take a look at how do people get on the ballot? How are people facilitated in being able to participate in the process and thinking that, hey, history is not made by others, but history can be made by me. I am the government. It's not just them and we, the citizenry. I can be part of the government and I can participate in power, which Marcus Cicero said was the highest form of happiness there. So in addition to lowering the barriers, I would also say that we have to start early. I'm very pleased that my dad spoke up, even though he was not a panelist, and talked about his days in Cicero. You can grow up in a culture of non-corruption, and every parent knows this when they hear the excuse that every kid at one point or another says to their parents, "But Mom, but Dad, everybody does it." Everybody does it is the beginning of an acceptance of, okay, well, everybody does it, but that doesn't mean you're going to do it. First of all, not everybody has your mother or your father. And everybody does it does not necessarily mean it is right.
When we talk about gangs, which is what I was asked to speak about here, because I've been doing research on gangs for 30 years, whatever, and corruption, What we're talking about, you know, in Chicago particularly, is the vast amount of money that's raised by illegal rackets. And when you're looking at the patterns today, and two of my students are here, Bart and Ivana, we're studying with Dick Simpson, we're studying police corruption in Chicago. The master pattern is that there was a change of who controlled the retail markets, drug markets, and up till the 60s, which was the outfit, and then after that, the street gangs forcibly took them over, and so they had lots and lots of money, and lots of money to buy protection, to buy police, and we start to see all the scandals that Tom Gritt was saying. You see the latest example of cops that were arrested, and we've got hundreds of cases of corruption. But that presents a problem, a couple problems in understanding what's going on and how to control it. And the first one is that you look at, I like your thing about everyone does it, because when I interview police, particularly police who've been caught, that's the basic rap. Everyone does it. But they also, it's a lot like Rostenkowski when Dick was mentioning that what's the line between delivering the goods and corruption, right? There's a lot of similarity, and I guess it's whether you get caught or not seems to be one of the major issues. And when you look at police work, and you look at what police say when they're caught, is that they say they were doing good police work. And so what you see on the streets in doing a drug arrest is, right, I've got to go and I work with one gang and they give me information, so I cut you a pass and I let you go, and you can see the potentials. There's so much money around, the potential for corruption is really great on the streets when you've got hundreds of millions of dollars and the stress to do good, to make arrests. All sorts of things happen. I was interviewing one policeman who had been caught and did time. And I said, well, when did you realize you were crossing the line? And he said, there is no line. So what that starts to raise about culture and controlling it is that maybe the target of looking at the guys on the street who are doing it, maybe we ought to look at what Susan Rose Zackerman talks about, the higher level corruption, or looking at what goes on above. And then we get into some more interesting issues. I really like the fact that people brought up the outfit and the mafia here, because the notion that they're gone is sort of, I'm always interested why people think that they're gone. They certainly have gone upstairs and have lots and lots of ties with politicians that are going on, and it's really not politic to talk about them that much, but this is a multi-million-dollar worldwide organization that has been able to get very respectable. But more interesting, I think, when we look at the problems of the culture and what to do with it, is that when we look at the case of John Burge, and Burge was not a corrupt cop, he was a brutal cop. He tortured at least 135 black men, and everyone knew about it. Yes, everyone knew about it. They heard it. They were the screams, and we know it's documented all up and down the ladder, from prosecutors to judges to state's attorneys to OPS, and yet no one did anything about it. There was a culture, not so much on the streets. People know right and wrong, and not everyone tortured. When Burge stopped in Area 5 and went to Area 3, the torture moved. There was no more torture in Area 5, right? So people knew about this, but they didn't do anything about it. The people above him didn't say what, your mother would say, stop! This is crazy, you shouldn't do this stuff. So what I'm starting to learn about how to approach corruption on the streets is we got to look at the suites. We got to look above to those systems of those accountable people who've let it go on, right? And we need to target those. And what do we learn, internationally about how we've dealt with corruption? Well, there's been two sort of fundamental lessons in the stuff when people have studied this around the world. You know, one is that police departments don't police themselves and need external review. We can forget about that one. It's never going to happen. They're never that. I think we should keep proposing it and keep pushing it. The Chicago police and the mayor is not going to have an effective external review body, and you know, it's just, that's one of those long-term issues that we have to keep working on. But the other issue is what's more interesting, is what's been found to be successful is changing the system of incentives within the police department so that there's a culture of honesty. But it seems to me that this would be misdirected if what we would be saying to cops on the street who are dealing with this line and how to deal with all this stuff, we'll give you benefits if you turn on your fellow cop. Because there's the blue coat of silence, everything. I mean, this becomes very difficult, and we know how hard it is. You know, specifically the SOS case, when the officers started to give testimony, Fitzgerald, Finnegan called up some 2-6 gang members and called a hit on his fellow cops. I mean, this is real stuff. You're just trying to snitch, to try to give information, to be honest one way or the other. But it seems to me that the incentive structure should work to encourage information about the people that are in authority. That we need to figure out how to define this as the real problem. There's a problem with everybody does it, and that you cross a line, you do right and wrong. There's absolutely a problem. But we're not going to change this culture on the street unless we change the culture among those people who have the authority, the responsibility to change it. That, it seems to me, should be the target of change in dealing with police culture.
Thank you, Jim. Next, we'll go to David.
Thank you, Governor. I am reminded of something Mo Udall once said at the end of a long debate in the 1976 campaign. He was, I think, the 6th of 6 candidates to speak, and he said, everything's been said, but not everybody has said it. I feel a little bit that way here on the final panel today. Another line he had, I thought was pretty good, was, I feel like Elizabeth Taylor's 5th husband. I know what to do, but I don't know how to make it interesting. 7th husband? Okay. Thank you. Anyway, I'm really pleased to be here, and I want to congratulate Jim and those involved in the Illinois Integrity Initiative. I think it's just, you're doing the Lord's work, and it's as someone relatively new to Illinois, it's refreshing to see all the people in the reform movement working hard to try to make this my new home state a better place. I think it's easy to get discouraged, and I sense sort of an undertow of woe is us, what do we do here in this gathering today? And I think there's a lot of things that can be done, and we're certainly at the Simon Institute trying to do something. We're all along these same lines. We're going to take Paul Simon's Institute and try to gather data and information and academic expertise. You'll see in your folders a flyer for those of you who want to submit papers. I've got a number of people today who've mentioned things, and so I'd encourage you to keep that in mind for as something we're going to do this fall, to focus on some of this same subject, trying to bring in some people from outside Illinois to focus on what other states have done. A few general things. I agree with the governor, there's no silver bullet, but I think that there are a whole host of things. It's not either or, it's sort of all of the above. And we can't make the good the enemy of the better, we just simply have to try them all. The first, I think the single most important thing that can foster reform in Illinois and change this culture is redistricting. I come from Iowa. They do a nonpartisan redistricting there. It works for that state. The state is 4 times larger, it has a much more significant minority population, so maybe that exact system isn't one you could graft into this state. But that's why we've commissioned a couple of our law students to try to do some work researching Florida, California, and Arizona and their redistricting systems. Florida and California both adopted, through citizen initiative, a much more transparent process of drawing legislative and congressional district lines. Let a computer do it, sort of thing. Now they're in the middle of this. It's a struggle. They're new, but I think Illinois could look at those systems after the 2012 election, see how they work. They're large states. They have diverse populations, and they're irregularly shaped. I would submit that what's being done in California and in Florida, and maybe in Arizona, would be something that we ought to look to as a template for making reforms here in the way we draw district lines. I think district lines, nonpartisan redistricting, is the way you break back of this issue. You start to get at the core of power and control and good old boys, and you turn it over to the citizens to decide who their representatives are. You create more competitive districts. You break up local power empires. There are a lot of things to be said for this kind of a system, but and we don't know all the answers, and we're in the middle of this election campaign, so we sort of have to see how it plays out in Florida and California. But I really do hope that all of us will take a look after the November elections and after all the litigation to see how did it work in those states, and could we try to do something here. I know the Fair Vote people have been looking at this. I think that's commendable, and we're certainly going to have a gathering in Springfield after, when I say we, I mean the Simon Institute. We're going to try to invite you all down and bring in some expertise from NCSL to look at that question. So that's to me, that's the first thing. The second thing, and it's a crude tool, but I think if we can't find other ways to make reforms, people in this state have to look at term limits. For some reason, that just seems to be dismissed. It's a Tea Party thing. It's the riffraff and the hoi polloi out there talking about term limits. But look, if you can't do it any other way, then the electorate has to use crude tools. It may also have the advantage of being something you could use through citizen initiative. As many of you know in this room, the Illinois Constitution only allows citizen initiative in the legislature in a very narrow set of circumstances. I tend to think redistricting might fall under that, but I certainly think limiting the terms of members is a clear discussion of the policy and procedure of the legislative chambers. So I think the whole notion of term limits is something that has to be looked for, and could be a place where different reform groups could work with Tea Party reformers. They're reformers too, and I think there could be some collaborations there. As I say, I thought I'd never say that, but because I think there's a lot wrong with that, with the idea of term limits. It certainly doesn't make your state any fiscally more responsive. Look at California; they have term limits. You can't sell it on that basis. You sell it solely on the basis of being a crude tool to break up, to upset the apple cart, to break up the monopoly that machines and big donors have over the political process. Just a couple other thoughts. I want to underscore the third thing would be civic education. We're certainly involved in that. I think more support has to be given to efforts at civic education. Several references have been made to Father and Cicero. Governor Edgar has mentioned this with younger people in Illinois. They have to start, in the grade school. Try to light up a cigarette in front of a third grader. I mean, you can affect cultural change with young people, and I think that has to be something that we do in our schools, and simply stressing the message that public service is that. It's not a way of doing business, and that requires a big change. And finally, I want to underscore, I spent 34 years as a reporter in Iowa, covering presidential politics, among other things. I think that what's going on with the press corps needs some discussion, and those of you from Medill can certainly talk about this a lot. First of all, we all know that the media in this country is being eviscerated, and hundreds and thousands of reporters are losing their jobs, and I often wonder what's happened to the stories those people would be working on. So we have to find ways to replace that. Secondly, we're awash in information, blogs and all that, and it's just, there's so much trash out there that it really is cluttering the market for credible information. And third, one of the things I've noticed as a consumer of Illinois news is that this state, its media markets are balkanized. There's nothing, the most important force in our culture is television, and yet we do not have a statewide television network, a statewide system of pulling us together, you know, as a people in Illinois. I come in from southern Illinois. A lot of misunderstandings and antipathy toward Chicago. I think if people in southern Illinois saw on their televisions each night what was happening in the street, in minority neighborhoods in Chicago, they might have a better appreciation for the issue of gun violence. So we have to have a media that works to tie us together as a people, as a culture. I think that finally media people oftentimes are too quick to throw a punch. Correct me if I'm wrong, Paul's correcting me. Shakespeare once said, if you strike a king, kill him. And I think too many reporters are out there taking wing shots at politicians, raising questions about politicians, raising questions about people in public life without any real evidence. You know, I was always taught by Mike Lawrence, among other people, that if you use the word corrupt about a politician, that means they've been convicted of a crime. To journalists, that has a legal meaning, and you don't call somebody corrupt if they haven't been convicted, or you could lie or say. Now, you can call them unethical, you can call them rotten, you can call them turkeys, you can call them all that. But I think reporters have to be more judicious in when you throw a punch. That if you're gonna go after some politician, if you're gonna attack them and criticize them, you better have the goods. Don't do it through wink, wink, and nod, nod, and innuendo, which I see a lot of columnists doing. Because all that does is just, it makes ethical issues muzak. And what happens is the people in Illinois they get tired of that buzz. And they don't pay any attention to it when somebody has a serious story to report. This is a big problem for this state. It's one that can no longer be dismissed. But I'm hopeful for a different reason. I'm a believer that all the right things get done in life for all the wrong reasons. Illinois now has a stain on it, thanks to Governor Blagojevich, that is bigger and deeper than it has ever had before. I think Bob Rich in his paper alludes to this, and Jim Nolan in his. This now hurts us for economic development. We may not be able to do ethics reform issues in this state because nobody cares about ethics reform, but they do care about jobs. And the ability of this state to attract and expand business is now at risk because of these problems. Who wants to bring a business to a state where A, you don't know what the tax situation is going to be, how high it's going to be and what it's going to be because of the fiscal mess, and C, you don't know whether you have to pay to play. There are lots of other places to put your business. Okay, there are lots of other nice, clean, Midwestern states, Indiana, Iowa, Wisconsin, other places you can put your business and it'll grow, and you just don't have these issues. So I tend to think that that is going to be an added incentive that may have not been in the wrinkle before, that is going to prompt people in this state to take a second look at ethics and reform issues, and hopefully we can get something, you know, something good done, maybe for the wrong reason, but I think protecting this state and making it a better place for economic growth is very important to our future.
Thank you, David. Aren't you glad you came to Illinois, which is a lot more exciting than Iowa?
It is. You know, we have politicians over there that do things. I mean, we had one of my first stories was an adjutant general of the state who was scheduling air guard flying missions to Miami all the time, and he was always on it. People wonder, why is he doing this? Well, he was going down there to see his girlfriend, and so that's probably never happened in Illinois. But so we got a few, but certainly not on the scale here.
Brad?
Thank you, Governor. And since I'm the last panel member to speak, I'll be very brief. But you know, David just said something that I believe is very true. How can you change the culture of corruption in Illinois? I think fundamentally we need redistricting reform. When I served on the Illinois Reform Commission, I chaired the committee that was looking at redistricting reform. I also chaired the Illinois Fair Map Coalition. Obviously, we fell short in the number of signatures needed to get the citizen initiative on the ballot for this particular election. But there is a great coalition. Terry's a part of it. Illinois Change, the League of Women Voters, a number of other groups, the State Chamber of Commerce, the Illinois Farm Bureau. We're not giving up this fight. We're currently tweaking the language of the redistricting constitutional amendment, and we intend to launch it after the 2012 election to get it on the ballot for 2014. In Illinois, 98% of incumbents get reelected. Are Illinoisans really that happy with their state legislators? The simple answer is no, but they create these very safe districts for either the Democrats or for the Republicans. Of course, they do it all in secret, behind closed doors. They look at people's voting history, and we come up with some of the most gerrymandered districts anywhere in the country. And the problem with that is accountability. If you believe that you really don't have to worry about whether or not you get reelected, then you will not have the courage to make some of the important decisions that need to be made to truly turn the state back in a better direction, whether it be pension reform, getting our budget in order. You're just not going to tackle those issues because you really don't have to worry about whether or not you get reelected because you have a safe district drawn for you behind closed doors. And for me personally, I mean, that should outrage Illinois citizens that that's the process we have, that in secret, behind closed doors, they look at your voting history and they draw these boundaries. Now, of course, there was redistricting reform passed by the Illinois General Assembly. I think they released the map on a Friday and they voted on it on a Monday. So that was the new transparency of Illinois redistricting reform after the last census. You know, one of the other things that Pat Collins, who chaired the commission, really tried to fight for was stronger law enforcement tools for state and local law enforcement officials. We are way behind other states in the law enforcement tools that we give our state and local. I mean, the truth is those corruption numbers in Illinois would go way up if it wasn't Pat Fitzgerald that had to bring all the cases in Illinois, because he's the only one that really can, because he's the only one that really has the law enforcement tools to bring the investigations and then the charges. So I think those are two legislative things that could, one's legislative, one's a citizen-led constitutional amendment. You know, you talked about the importance of civic education, and we've heard a lot of negativity here today. My former boss was Congressman Ray LaHood, who's now U.S. Secretary of Transportation Ray LaHood, and he used to be Chief of Staff for Bob Michael, who I first started to work for in politics many years ago. Those two gentlemen, in my opinion, are role models for how to do public service the right way. We had a rule in Congressman LaHood's office when I was Chief of Staff that if you did constituent work for somebody and they sent you a thank you for that work, but also included a campaign check, that we would return the campaign check. We never wanted there to even be the appearance that we were doing our public service work for some kind of campaign contribution or some type of private gain. There are good, honest, decent public servants. We just need to encourage that, and I think one of the ways to do that is through civic education. I direct the Institute for Principled Leadership at Bradley University. I teach ethical leadership to hopefully a new generation, and I know it's a drop in the bucket when you think about the whole state, but we need to try and slowly but surely turn in a better direction. And a number of other speakers have talked about how this change will take a significant period of time, and I do believe that, but I am hopeful that we can turn this state in a better direction. It may take 5, 10, 15 years before we start to see significant improvements, but I think it's a worthy cause. I really commend Jim Nolan and the U of I for the Illinois Integrity Initiative. I think we need to have this discussion continue. So I really appreciate the opportunity to just say a few words, and I think we can open it up.
Thank you, Brad, and I think your former boss is probably a very relieved father today, too.
Absolutely.
Let me, before I turn over to the audience for questions, ask the panelists if they have any questions of anyone on the panel. Comments, okay. We'll throw it open.
I have to incriminate, and please forgive me for those of you who are part of the media. But I'm going to give you two examples of corruption that are not in government that we can do something about, perhaps, if not. I'm a doctor, and one of the things I know about, and I'm also a lawyer, know that 98,000 people a year die of infections in the United States. And yet, with a camera, I've taken pictures of people going to Costco, going to local supermarkets with their stethoscopes hanging out of the pockets with scrub suits, walking into the University of Illinois, walking into Rush, walking into Northwestern with their scrub suits on. Now, how do you stop that from happening? And I have to blame the media for this, because I tried to get the media to stop this. I tried to get the universities to stop this, and they say, no, that doesn't happen, and yet I have pictures to do that. Second, and I can say this, and I'm sorry to say this, my wife is Polish, but I just arrived from Europe the other night. When I go to Europe, I have a bad heart, bad problem with my spine. I get off the airplane, and there's a cart waiting for me, taking me anywhere I want to. Have you ever come to Chicago and tried to get a cart? It's run by the Polish mafia. The people are there with wheelchairs. They have to sign in. They have to get little slips of paper. The kids who are running it are decent kids, but it's all run by an organization. And I asked the young man who was taking me in there, and I gave him a tip because he's a young kid. I said, are you Polish? He says, yes, I am. So how does the media stop or help us in government or even just public life in stopping some of these things from happening? They're very, very silent sometimes, and they take the governmental positions or other positions. I'm sorry.
No, thank you for your question. And I, as a former elected official, I bash the media all the time, and I probably shouldn't. But since, David, you're a former media person, I'll let you bash him here on our answer that.
Well, we could have a whole conference on the media and the issues in the media. But I think in fairness to reporters, as I mentioned, there are fewer and fewer of them. And they're having to do more and more work. And there are many stories that get overlooked. It isn't any giant conspiracy. It isn't any bias. It's just simply there's too much on their plate. And so a difficult story, the investigative story, the stakeout story, it just takes too much time. And an editor and a journalist have to make a decision that, you know, we've got other things we can and have to do. So,
you know, that's one of the real unfortunate thing as we see the shrinkage of the media, or at least the media that I grew up relying on. There's a lot of coverage out there. It's just so dispersed, and whether you can believe it or not, because the media is an important part of the whole checks and balance. And I'm a believer that a lot of the problems we've talked about today is a breakdown in checks and balances. And the media is one of that important part of that. And if they're not able to do their function properly, then more things are going to slip by. So it's unfortunate that we've seen the shrinkage of what I call the legitimate media. I think we're going to have to figure out, it's maybe a little tough for us old folks to figure out how to change, but how do we use whatever is taking its place and make sure it plays the proper role in those checks and balances? Paul Green.
Seldom am I surprised. Been around a long, long time. But I am surprised at one thing. So much emphasis is put on redistricting. And that somehow that is the, no more cliches, that's going to change things. And the history would suggest, following the 1970 Constitution, that the only time the Constitution worked the way it was supposed to work was when you had two political bosses cut a deal in 1974, Blair and Partee. I think you were there, Jim, but you weren't part of that because you were. That was the only time the only time, other than this last time when the Democrats pulled the triple, that you had a mixed government without going to pulling the damn thing out of the hat. So my question is, given that background, if you went to any redistricting system you want. Why would that create less corruption, better government, given the fact that unlike Iowa, with a very diverse population in Illinois, you would automatically have at least 1, 2, maybe 3 lawsuits immediately, based on color, based on federal court decisions, and you would have basically a revolt among elected officials against their leadership. So how would this somehow be the panacea by which good government could come to Illinois because of a more fair redistricting system? And one last add-on, the notion of more competition may sound really good in a place like this, or in a university. But if you're an elected official, a competition is a 4-letter word.
Let me, before you, I want to, because he brings up a good point that I have to say I've been surprised we've heard so much about redistricting. Not because I think the way it's done now is great. I think it has real problems, particularly because we haven't gone to the draw. I mean, we haven't let that work, because I remember in 1970, it was actually in 1971, I worked for the one party out on that, but I was quietly every night talking with Ed Madigan and Bob Blair about what worked and what didn't work. But you had, at that case, you did have pretty evenly divided districts, and you had more choice on election day in November. And again, I think there's problems with the system, but I've never thought of it bringing corruption. So let me just say, I'm with Paul. I'm curious how the connection is made there.
Well, first of all, I want to make sure that the audience understands that the constitutional amendment for redistricting that we were moving forward with in Illinois was not the Iowa model, because our state is way too diverse from a demographic perspective. And the amendment clearly said that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act would be fully followed, and minority protections were in the amendment. So what you would end up having, you'd have some districts up in the Chicago area that would be drawn in unique ways in order to ensure that there were minority districts. But then there's the rest of the state of Illinois, where the percentage of minority voting population isn't such that you're gonna run in to those Voting Rights Act considerations. And so through the rest of the state, you'd end up seeing more normally drawn districts without all kinds of crazy lines. I agree with you, Governor, that it's not necessarily tied to corruption. I'm not making that connection. What the connection we're making is that it's better, will lead to better government if you have competitive elections. Now, the statement that you made was looking at it from the elected officials' viewpoint, which I agree. They don't want competitive elections. They don't want to be held accountable. They want to be protected and want to be able to stay in office as long as they want to. But that's not necessarily what's in the public's best interest. I mean, and I think, one of the things serving on the Illinois Reform Commission, probably the lasting impression that I had after being on that for a year and going to all the hearings and going through all of that, is that, and this is going to sound like an oversimplification, but in Illinois, we've lost sight of the fact that public service is about serving the public and not serving a few powerful leaders or a few powerful interests, but we...
Can I answer your question? That's a process redistricting. The end result, you have an election. How would those people being elected through your process improve the state of Illinois?
Well, what you'd end up having is you'd have more competitive elections, and you wouldn't have a 98% incumbent reelection rate, and so you'd have a lot more turnover of newer people coming in to the system, which we think would be
Can I add a question to that? Just add on to that. We're looking at it from politicians and better government, but when you're looking at it from the point of view of bureaucracies that are there and stable, where the bulk of the corruption is going on, the bulk of the problems, what is the relationship of redistricting to reforming bureaucracies like a police department? When in working in them and having studied bureaucracies, one of the things is if you get a turnover, you get somebody new, you love it because it takes some years to catch on to what you're doing, right? So what is it about redistricting that would change the practice of bureaucracies like police departments or sewer departments or whatever?
Well, wait a minute. We've said there is no cure-all. I think this may be an example of where maybe it wouldn't affect a bureaucracy. It might, because it starts going to cultural change. I think it disrupts the influence of leaders. Members of the legislature do not owe their seat to a member, to a leader with a crayon in some Chicago law office. Secondly, it creates, as Brad said, it creates more competitive seats. You're not paying attention to the partisan makeup of the district or the incumbency of the member or the residents of the member. And finally, it simply creates more open seats. It allows more competition. It allows new people to come into the process. It allows more women. I think it actually allows more women and minorities to participate because it just simply opens it up. And finally, Iowa system works for Iowa. That's why I said the Iowa type model may not work here, but that's why I think we need to look at Florida, Arizona, California, which are larger states with diverse populations, and we all, in all states, have to subscribe to the Voting Rights Act. That's not optional, whether it's in the constitutional amendment or not. It has to be comply with the Voting Rights Act.
I'm going to end on the redistricting because we only got about 5 minutes to get some. It might be something we ought to have a conference on in the future. I think there's a lot of points to be debated here, but it is obvious for a lot of you this is a major concern, which I have to say I'm with Paul. I was a little surprised, but on this part of the thing. But I think maybe at a later date, one of the institutes ought to or get together and have one on redistricting because I'd love to be there, but we're running out of time. Questions on other topics? Yes.
David brought up an interesting point about corruption being bad for business and bad for the private sector. You know, education in Illinois, education funding, the way we think about education in Illinois changed tremendously in the 80s. When the business community got interested in education and public education in Chicago schools, not because we should be having good public education, but because it was a workforce issue. It was an economic issue. We needed better product out of the schools so that we didn't have to do so much retraining. And so it is, you know, I have wondered, why doesn't the business community get more engaged? Where's the Chamber of Commerce? Where's the Manufacturers Association in this issue? If this is bad for Illinois' reputation and bad for people wanting to come into Illinois, then, or maybe a better question is, how can we engage the business community in this issue the way that they got engaged in education back in the 80s in terms of trying to fix the quality of public schools in Illinois?
Well, I think one of the problems in some of the groups you mentioned, they're down there in the arena every day, and they may not want to rock the boat on this issue. I mean, to be very candid with you. I also agree with you. If you want to bring about major change in Illinois government, the business community, if it gets involved and puts their leverage behind an issue, they can have huge impact on everything except maybe business issues, because then they're suspect. But if they do it on other issues, like they did in education, and I think they could be a major player on this, but the people who are in Springfield, they are there to lobby on business issues, and they don't usually want to, you know, rock the boat. You'd have to go to the CEOs, and the one group in the state I think that's probably the most active is the Civic Committee. They're tied up right now trying to reform pensions, which that might preoccupy them right now. But I think it's a good strategy point of view down the road. One more question, comment? Yes.
That's all right.
I wanted to, like Brad, I had the good fortune of working for a member of Congressman, I think it was cut from the same cloth, Congressman John Porter, and Bob Michael, and Mr. LaHood. But it reminded me, when you made that comment, that David had mentioned, I don't think he was necessarily strongly advocating term limits, but had we had the kind of term limits that are often advocated by the proponents in place, the John Porters and the Bob Michaels and the Ray LaHoods of the world and many others would never have had an opportunity to be reelected by their constituents and to do some, I would argue, many good things. I've always been extremely wary of these institutional reforms to our problems that abdicate responsibility on behalf of the citizenry. I mean, term limits are an absolutely perfect out for any citizen who does not care to become involved because, don't blame me, we have this absolute hard term limit in place which is going to cause automatic turnover whether or not these people are doing a good job in office. It seems to me the framers of this country, who gave us our Constitution, had a little bit more faith in the judgment of the citizenry to determine whether or not someone should serve or be replaced. And term limits, to me, are an institutional reaction to a perceived problem that I think could conceivably do more harm than good. If the panel has any feelings about that, I just don't see how that's really going to get to the heart of our problem.
And there's an unintended consequence. I mean, we do have term limits for the presidency.
Well,
Republicans thought that was a real neat way to get at Franklin Roosevelt, and they wound up nailing Ronald Reagan.
And by the way, and as a staffer who used to work on the Hill, I say God bless the term limits proponents because it puts the unelected staff in a great position. I mean, because we have this constant turnover and people who are there forever know how it works, and there's nobody to check what's going on at the bureaucratic or staff level.
You know, one of the things that the Illinois Reform Commission recommended was term limits on leadership in Springfield. And I do believe the state would benefit greatly from that turnover. The arguments on broader term limits, Bob Michael is one of my all-time favorites. 38 years in Congress, longest-standing House Minority Leader. He did it the old-fashioned way. He formed good relationships, worked hard, moved his way up in leadership. I'm getting more open, honestly, to term limits simply because I think there's some structural problems with our election system, with the influx of campaign money and other influences that make it harder. And so I don't know. I could actually go both ways, but I do think term limits on leaders down in Springfield would be a good idea.
Another topic we ought to have another symposium on is maybe term limits someplace down the road. I tend to agree with you, though. I do believe 2 terms for a governor and 2 terms for a president, I think is fine. I think just you wear yourself out, your staff out, and you need to do a change. Legislators, I'm not sure, though. Leaders, I'm thinking maybe it may be good after 30 years. Maybe you ought to change. But anyway, that's another topic. You had a comment, then we're going to let you have the last comment.
Well, then I better sum it up good.
No, I'm actually going to sum it back to you, so I'll get the last word.
So term limits, citizen initiative, redistricting, different types of voting, all of these are ideas to percolate how to make it easier to get new people, new blood, new ideas into the system so that we don't have an entrenched bureaucracy where 98% of the people are returned all of the time. And so whether you believe in one or another or maybe a combination or only one because we don't have another, I think these are a much bigger discussion of how do we open up the political process so that we have a competitive democracy and so that we don't end up with entrenched cultures. Now, over the course of the day, we've talked about entrenched ethnic cultures, entrenched geographic cultures, entrenched professional, like the police cultures. And one thing we haven't talked very much about is that sometimes it takes an outsider. It takes an inspector general. It takes an auditor. It takes somebody from the media or the citizenry. It takes an outsider to that particular entrenched culture to break up the culture or call it and say, I don't care if this is the way we've always done it here. There are other standards. There are other states that do it a different way. There is just, this is just unacceptable no matter what the particular entrenched culture is.
As I said in my open remarks, we have a window of opportunity that is slowly closing. And we need to see some positive results. The other thing I would suggest to you, too, you need to prioritize. I would, and I think Paul Green and I probably agree, even if you did think you needed to do redistricting to change this, that's going to be really hard to achieve. There might be some other things that you might have a better shot at. And at some point in these discussions, I think you ought to prioritize, not saying you do little, just little things, but try to figure out what are some of the big things that we have a better chance on moving on than some other big things. Because, as I said, I think the window of opportunity is going to close. I think there's still some opportunity there. There'll, be a few more whenever Governor Blagojevich goes off to jail. That'll reignite the jokes. And I have to. Is it 2 weeks? Yeah, well, he'll probably do something down there to remind us too, over out there in Colorado. So, but again, I would hope that the discussion continues, and again, maybe at the next gathering, you can begin to kind of taper it down to some action that could be taken, and begin to see some results. If it was easy, we'd have done it a long time ago. It's not easy, and it's going to take some time, so I wish you all well. Thank you very much.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.